Welcome back to part 2 of my new 4-part series where I am taking a look at the worst card in every single TCG structure deck ever released. Now, these cards aren't only selected by myself. I do all of these things live. So on the live stream, we take a look at the full card list of each structure deck, and we all kind of have an open discussion about which cards we think are the worst. In many cases, my opinion has changed, and in many cases, it gets down to 2 almost identically bad cards, but somebody has to make a call, and that someone has to be me. I will mention some of the cards that almost made the cut as we go along here, but just know that if it's a card that seems like it should have been on the list, but is really close in power level to the card that made it on the list, that there probably was a debate about it, because a lot of these were pretty hard to narrow down. In this video, we're going to be talking about all these structure decks from Rise of the Dragon Lords through Gates of the Underworld. A lot of these actually were pretty good, which is very different from the last 10 that we looked at, because in the last 10, almost all of them were really bad structure decks, so there were a lot of competition for cards that were terrible, but these ones, because they were good, sometimes it was a little bit harder to actually select which was the worst card on the deck. But anyway, let's get started. So first, in Rise of the Dragon Lords, we have one of my favorite artworks of all time, and that is Decoy Dragon. Now, I already talked about this a little bit in the bad structure deck review of this deck, but Decoy Dragon is just frustrating because your opponent's simply never going to attack it. All they're going to do is use some sort of spot removal on it, meaning that you'll never get the revive effect. And while to some people, they might look at that saying, okay, well, if your opponent just never attacks it, that's a good thing. The problem is that even when this card was released, every single deck did have spot removal, which meant the only time your opponent was letting you revive a card is if they knew they could deal with it. And it's just a really slow card, and it actually remained pretty valuable for a while just because I believe that Rise of the Dragon Lords was its only printing for a long time, if not still the only printing. And despite its really cute, adorable artwork, it sadly has just never been good, mostly because your opponent just, I mean, if it triggered its effect when it attacked things, that might be pretty cool. But the fact that it requires your opponent to go out of their way to kill it makes it pretty lackluster. Next, we have the Dark Emperor structure deck, and this card is Samsara Kaiser. I don't know if I pronounced that correctly, but I'll obviously put it on the screen. And man, this card is like a really, really bad Treeborn Frog. So when you tribute a monster when you tribute summon a monster by tributing this card, return this card to your hand. Now, this was released in the deck that had all of the banishing effects. It also included Caius, the Shadow Monarch, and the idea was you were tributing this card. Even though it was getting banished, you just add it back to your hand. Actually, I don't even think it hits the banish zone when you tribute it, but it went back to your hand regardless. Next turn, you could summon it, and then the next turn, you could tribute it. The problem is that's really, really slow, and this thing probably won't survive a turn. But the bigger issue is that in this same structure deck, you had both DD Warrior and DD Scout playing. Both cards work really well with tributing under Macrocosmos because they immediately come back. And they come back even if you didn't tribute them. They come back if they were just destroyed. As long as they left the field and were banished, well, in the case of Scout playing, it doesn't even have to leave the field as long as it was banished. Those cards all come back for free, which means that this card is a little bit weird sort of in the structure deck where there's cards that are strictly better than it. Then you could look at this card in decks that don't actually have banishing effects, but in that case, just play like Treeborn Frog or literally anything else. Even a card like Soul Exchange is better than this card simply because of how slow it is. Maybe there's like an imaginary deck where you can special summon this card from your hand every single turn with some other effect and immediately tribute it off, but we haven't seen that type of deck, even though we've seen a variety of tribute summon decks become popular over the last couple of years, meaning this card is probably just going to be obscure and bad forever. Next, we have the Zombie World structure deck, and this one was not very difficult. I think that Gurnia, once again, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, is the worst card. Also, it's the ugliest card in the structure deck, and only a face that a mother could love. If you can even call that a face, it's pretty weird looking. Anyway, during the next standby phase, after this face-up card you control is destroyed and sent to the graveyard by an opponent's card effect, special summon it. So, on the off chance that your opponent uses a piece of spot removal on this face-up 1300 attack monster, you can bring it back from the graveyard. Now, would this card be broken if you could bring it back from the graveyard if it was destroyed by any card effect, or even if it would be destroyed by anything, like such as battle? No, this card would still be pretty bad. But the fact that, I mean, I can't fathom a situation where your opponent uses actual spot removal on a 1300 attack monster, and you can make the argument like, oh, what if they Dark Hole it and it's just like killed with everything else? And it's like, wouldn't they just run us over by battle first? It's just, I don't know why this card exists. And I think this was a tournament pack or champion pack card at one point that was actually kind of hard to come by. I think this was like its first reprint, if I remember correctly. I'm sure someone will correct me, but man, this card's terrible. I don't know who in their right mind would ever use spot removal to kill it. Probably not someone that you need to worry about winning against. Anyway, moving on. We have Spellcaster's Command. And this one was tough for some people because there's a lot of bad cards in the structure deck, a lot of really bad cards that relate to placing spell counters on the field. But I think overall the worst card is Magical Plant Mandragola. And I'm probably man, weird. This is like the episode where we pronounce every card wrong. But regardless, this card's bad. It's basically a worse version of that Snow Dragon card I talked about in a couple videos back, because it has no good stats, right? It's a level 2 monster, so that's not really good. 500 attack, 200 defense. Yes, you can bring it out with the Apprentice Magician. No, that doesn't matter. And when it's flipped up, you get to place a spell counter on each card on the field that can have a spell counter placed on it. That is so ridiculously slow and just completely unnecessary, because there's other cards in the deck that do this way more efficiently and are way faster. There's like Spell Power Grasp or Power Spellgrasp, whatever the new spell card that was released in that structure deck was, where you can place a spell counter on something, but then it's also a spell card, so the spell counter gets just placed on stuff naturally, so you get 2 spell counters on things, and you can do that in your main phase instead of having to wait a turn to set this card. Not to mention, if your opponent kills the thing that you're trying to put a spell counter on, by the time they get flip face up, this card is just a dead monster. It's just so slow, so ridiculously slow in a deck that doesn't need cards like this, and I can't really think of a situation where you would want to set this card instead of summoning the better spellcasters in the deck. Moving on, we have the Warriors Strike structure deck. Now, this is the one that's all about Geminis, and not all of the Geminis are terrible. At least some of them have high attack stats, or relatively high attack stats, but the worst one is Gemini Soldier. This card's effect is actually not that terrible, so it's once per turn. If this card would be destroyed by battle, it is not destroyed. If this card battles, after damage calculation, you can special summon 1 level 4 or lower Gemini monster from your deck, except itself. Ideally, when you use that effect, you can then basically, because it survives 1 battle per turn, you're getting 2 special summons of level 4 monsters, assuming your opponent tries to get rid of this thing. And that sounds pretty good. You know what doesn't sound pretty good? A 500 attack normal monster. So yes, there are cards in this deck designed to give your Gemini monsters their effects immediately, but you're not always going to have those cards. And in the cases you don't have those cards, this thing is straight trash, because you have to summon it first and then use your normal summon from another turn, or even if there's a situation where you're reviving this thing, well, then you have to use your normal summon on this card's effect, which once again is not an aggressive effect, it's a defensive effect, which isn't necessarily bad. It's just that when the other Gemini effects are better than this one, I mean, almost all the other Gemini effects in this deck are better than this one, and they also come with like 1500 or 1600 attack bodies. This card just seems really, really slow and quite bad. The fact that it does have such a small amount of attack and defense just doesn't work very well. Although, like I said, this card would have been really cool if it wasn't a Gemini monster. If it was just an effect that special summoned guys from the deck, that'd be pretty cool. And it wouldn't have been broken because it's not like aggressive. You have to do it when it battles. So even if you were trying to attack into stuff, that wouldn't be like that powerful. But it would have been good. It would have been playable, but not the case with how they ended up going with this card. Moving on, we have Machina Mayhem and Commander Covington. So, boy, Commander Covington, this card in these series of cards, that the whole goal is to summon Machina Force, and that's not even like that bad. Actually, the individual pieces aren't very bad, but Commander Covington is pretty darn terrible. I wanted to put Armored Cybers on this list instead of this card, but Armored Cybers does have some mild uses just because it has 2000 defense, where Commander Covington, I mean, let's be honest here, you're never getting this effect off. Like, you're never getting this effect off if you just own one structure deck, or if you own 3 structure decks, or if you even specifically build a deck to get that summon off. It's almost never going to happen unless you happen to open like Soul Charge, and even in that case, it's not really that good. You're taking a -3 to summon a big guy. That's just not really worth it. But when you don't get the effect off, that means that this card is a 1000 attack normal monster, which is obviously not very strong. So because of the overall power level of that deck being pretty high, a card like Commander Covington just has to make this list, because there was really nothing else in the entire deck besides maybe Armored Cybern that even had a chance of being like this terrible. Moving on, we have Structure Deck Marik. Now, this one had a lot of bad cards, way more than any of the other ones on this list, specifically because this was sort of like a character deck, and in some ways it almost felt like a starter deck, just because starter decks usually are based on a character, and this one is obviously based on a character as well. But I think the worst card in it is Gravekeeper's Curse, because what are they thinking with this card? It's an 800 attack monster that does 500 damage when it's summoned. Outside of maybe some crazy loops that people came up with, this card seems absolutely terrible. And no, the boost from Necro Valley does not make it good. This card is just so bad. There are a lot of bad Gravekeeper's cards, but Gravekeeper's Curse is just on like a next level of how shitty it is. So yeah, don't play Gravekeeper's Curse. I think someone's probably come up with like a loop with it, but in terms of practicality, card's terrible. So anyway, moving on, we have Dragoonity Legion. Now, a lot of people thought that the Dragoonity cards in here had the potential to be the worst cards, but I actually think Dragon's Gunfire is the worst. What is this card doing? How is this? The damage effect is terrible. The destruction effect is maybe good in some really marginal situations, but overall just really bad. Not to mention that like you have to have a dragon to use this card. It's a worse Smashing Ground. It's a worse Ozaki. It's just one of the worst cards ever printed in terms of dragon support. Dragons have a lot of good support. Dragon's Gunfire is not part of that support though. We next have Lost Sanctuary. This was the structure deck that had all the really good agents in there, like Agent Earth, Agent Venus. Well, I guess Venus already came out, but Master Hyperion was in here. And this card, I thought I was misremembering how bad this card was, but no. Agent of Wisdom Mercury. What the hell was Konami thinking? So during your standby phase, if you controlled this face-up card and had no cards in your hand, at the end of the opponent's last end phase, draw 1 card. So you have to have this thing face up and have no cards in your hand during your opponent's end phase. Now, how the hell is that going to happen? It has 1700 defense, so maybe your opponent attacks into with a 1500 attack monster, and then it survives. And then you get 1 extra draw for all that work. No, don't. Why do you have to go so far out of your way to get this effect? Like, it's... Even if this card just said, if this card was face up at the end phase of your opponent's last turn, draw an extra card, it wouldn't be very good. But the fact that like you also have to have no cards in hand, like this is so bad. It's not to mention that like in the agent deck, there are a lot of cards that you like need to keep in your hand. Like you're not going to just summon Master Hyperion unless you actually have a way to do it and also want to destroy something in your opponent's side of the field. So if you have Master Hyperion in hand, you can never use this card. There's also like Honest in the structure deck. There's also like other fairy monsters that you can't always summon. It's just ridiculous. I don't see this card ever resolving. Like if you played like 1,000 games, I would be surprised if this resolved once. It's just that bad. And lastly, we have Gates of the Underworld. Now, this structure deck made a huge metagame impact, actually much like the Lost Sanctuary structure deck, because the Dark World monsters were very powerful. However, there was a card in there that was brand new that I literally didn't know existed until we looked up the full list of this deck. And that doesn't happen very often, right? Pretty much every time I come across a card in these structure decks, I know what they do. I've played Yu-Gi-Oh! For a lot of years, and I was playing Yu-Gi-Oh! When a lot of these came out, and I actually bought them when they were new. And I had no idea this card existed, and that is Dark Scheme. So Dark Scheme is, for all intents and purposes, the bad qualities of hand destruction and magic drain. So your opponent can discard one card to negate it. If they don't do that, then it's a hand destruction. You discard 2 cards, or both players discard 2 cards and then draw 2 cards. What? So the problem with this card, if you don't realize it, besides the fact that hand destruction is already bad because it's a -1, this at least triggers the Dark World effects. But the biggest issue is that they always have a chance to negate the effect, right? Because you can't use it unless your opponent has 2 cards in hand. So if they negate the effect, that means their hand is good and they want to keep it. And now you've just 1-for-1 traded and got a bad card out of their hand. If they don't negate the effect, that means their hand is bad and you're now helping them get a better hand. So in every scenario that you're using this card, it's always bad because your opponent gets to choose which outcome they want to happen. And it's just absolutely silly that you would even think of playing this card. It really is just the worst hand destruction, and that card is already like so bad, it's a meme. But anyway, that's going to wrap up part 2 of the worst card in every single structure deck. Let me know what you guys think about my choices, and I think we came to a lot of good ones here, but like I said, there's always going to be some contention over particular choices because so many of these cards are bad, and a lot of times we just have to make a call because I can't make a list that says every bad card released in Yu-Gi-Oh! But let me know what you guys think. Let me know what you're thinking for part 3 and part 4, and make sure to watch your notifications just because the next time that I go live, I will likely be narrowing down the choices for part 3, and then the next time I go live after that, I'll be narrowing down the choices for part 4. So just watch those notifications. You can press the bell if you want to. I don't really care if you do, but it's a lot of fun. We get about 100 to 200 watchers at a time, and we just kind of go through a whole bunch of bad cards and narrow it down. So I will see you guys later. Bye.